In this episode of Idaho Inside Out, we introduce you to Tasha Adams, a woman whose life took an unexpected turn when she met and married Stuart Rhodes, the founder of the Oath Keepers. Tasha's story is not just a personal account, it's a profound exploration of resilience in the face of manipulation and control. Hers is a journey that moves from the shadows of fear to the light of freedom, challenging the very nature of authoritarian and narcissistic relationships. As Tasha navigated her life with Rhodes, she encountered a man whose expertise in ideological camouflage was matched only by his narcissism. Initially drawn into a relationship marked by Rhodes' charm, Tasha soon found herself ensnared into an existence dedicated by his authoritarian desires, financial manipulation, and psychological torment. Like many extremist leaders in Idaho and within the Patriot movement, Rhodes exploited extremist ideologies for his own gain, revealing that his true loyalty was to his ego. Tasha's story becomes increasingly complex as Rhodes' ambitions grow, plunging their life into a realm of paranoia and extremism. However, this episode is also a celebration of Tasha's indomitable spirit. Determined to reclaim her freedom and safeguard her children, she embarked on a daunting journey to break free from Rhodes' tyrannical hold. This tale extends beyond Tasha's personal struggle, offering insight to the devastating impact of extremism on families and the challenging road to healing and rebuilding. Join us as we delve into the story of Tasha Adams, a testament to the power of resilience and hope against the backdrop of manipulation and control, unmasking Stuart Rhodes as the man driven by an insatiable love for his own ego rather than any genuine ideological commitment. Welcome to the show, Tasha.
Thank you for having me on.
So tell me a little bit about yourself and your experience.
Okay, well, my name is Tasha Adams, formerly Tasha Adams Rhodes. I was married to Stuart Rhodes, the leader of the Oath Keepers, for close to 30 years. My story starts, I guess, with him 1990 when I first met him, early 91. We first began dating and I was 18 and he was 25. I was a dance instructor right after high school, ballroom dance at Arthur Murray's, and he came in for dance lessons. And we just started dating early on in the relationship, just even dating, maybe several months in. I thought maybe he seemed a little controlling, even with my limited experience with dating, and grew up in the Mormon church and, you know, very limited exposure to, ice cream dates and double dates and that type of thing. So, yeah, he seemed a bit on the controlling side. A couple months in, I thought I was really rethinking the relationship and thinking maybe I need to cut this off. It's already trying to tell me what clothes to wear, or just seemed to be kind of a jerk and seemed to be a little bit paranoid sometimes, which concerned me. And then I got a call from his mother one day when I was at work that he had been in some sort of accident. And it turns out he had dropped a handgun and it shot him in the eye. And he was in the hospital. I didn't know he owned a 22. I only knew that he owned a Glock. And so I thought, wow, this is really bad. But it was actually a 22, and it went inside his eye socket and it rattled around. It destroyed his eye and was just sitting under the skin. Like 22s do, they bounce around a lot, right? They're famous for bizarre injuries like that, and that's what that was. Nowadays, if I was dating someone who I was going to break up with and they had a terrible accident, I would probably be like, well, that's unfortunate timing. But at 18, I thought, well, now what? Now I'm stuck, right? So I'm all in. And within just a few months, it was a situation where I just felt bulldozed over. His family's calling my family from the hospital, and his mother's, I'm running errands for his mother, and I'm just people I had never even met yet. I hadn't even met of his family at that point. And now all of a sudden, his sister's on the phone with my mother, and I just was, I felt brought in, and I just thought, well, I'm in this now, and I was. And yeah, years went by, and he seemed a little lost, and he definitely had problems with a temper. And he explained to me his temper problems were because he was restless. that he felt that there was something he needed to do in life and he wasn't doing it. And his family had never really supported him. His mother never thought much of college. And, he really needed to start going to school and improving himself and doing something with his life besides parking cars for a living. And I thought, man, I had such a nice childhood. I refer to my family as a board game family, which a lot of people who grew up in the LDS church kind of know what that means, right? A mom and dad, siblings, people spend time together, people like each other, a lot of laughter. And here he'd had this volatile childhood with a very violent single mother who'd been married like 6 times and moved every 6 months or so. And his grandparents had been migrant farm workers, and he spent summers with them in dirt floor shacks, and I just poverty and struggle and not a lot of emphasis on the children. And I thought, wow, I felt like I owed it to somebody who'd had a more difficult life than me to help. And so I stopped going to college myself, and I said, I will put you through school. And I did. But put through school was me doing, um, making all the money. And that went quickly because he spent a lot of money. He was a big spender. I would, barely get my paycheck in and it would be gone and bills are still due. And eventually, and this was obviously a progression of pressure that um, just sort of what I call now the eye of Sauron, where he would just focus on something and hyper focus and try to make you do something he wants you to do. And he would do it in such a way that no matter what happened, somehow the reason always came down to you not doing the thing he wants you to do. If he stubs his toe, somehow that's, well, this wouldn't have happened if I wasn't doing this thing and I did this thing because we don't have enough money, and we don't have enough money because you refused to work as a cocktail waitress, which is something I said I didn't feel comfortable with at that time. But at this point, I'm like 21, and it's Las Vegas and they wear skimpy outfits, and eventually he did talk me into that. And then that wasn't enough, and that wasn't enough, and we don't have enough money, and we don't have enough money because you are too emotionally immature. And if you weren't so emotionally immature, you would just work as a stripper. Like, what's wrong with doing that? They make plenty of money. And, I would do it if I could, but it's not how the world works. And you're just so selfish, and that just went on and on and on until I started working as a stripper. And then he would pick me up every day at 6 a.m., grab the money out of my hand, and that was our routine for years. But he did go to school during that time, and he did graduate summa cum laude. But again, his school also included a lot of moments where he would say, wow, we've made all these sacrifices. You sacrificed all your whatever Mormon values that he would sort of mock, and have been working all this time. And I'm on track to graduate summa cum laude. But this paper's due tomorrow, and I didn't have time to do it, and I don't have time to do it. I have other work to do. So if you don't write this paper by tomorrow for my French history honors class, I'm going to fail and I won't graduate summa cum laude, and it'll be your fault. And so I would stay up all night and write the damn paper. And, by the time he graduated with his bachelor's degree, I had done all the work for his honors, both his honors classes that were required for his summa cum laude. I had done multiple other papers. I had done almost all his extracurricular, it's like things that he needed for his art classes, like writing reviews of performances, or he had a column had a column in the school newspaper, and I wrote some of those. And so that. And then that was from there. I helped him apply to law schools, and he got into every single one that he applied to, and chose Yale. And then he went to Yale Law School, and I thought, man, this has been a hard road. It was a lot, and by that point, I was no longer working. I had kid after kid, And by the time he was in law school, I had 3 children by the time he was in law school. Um, and I thought, man, it's at least we're working for something, because you don't graduate from Yale Law School and then live in poverty, and at this point I had not lost contact with my family, but become very distant from them, mostly because he imposed himself on them so much that I was embarrassed to even talk to my mother, because he would always want to borrow money from her and not pay it back. He would always want something from her, want to use her car and turn it back in dirty, or just that type of thing, just run over her. And my mother would do anything for anyone, and would never say no to anyone. And it was just humiliating for me to be the only kid that just, here I am, is still borrowing money, and she's still co-signing for school loans or whatever. And so he did graduate from law school, and I thought, well, at least there's a light at the end of the tunnel. At least now he's going to be a lawyer. I can pay back my mom. I can restart a relationship with my family and not be so embarrassed. And I kept um, smoothing over the obvious psychological abuse, the occasional physical abuse, um, as being, and I knew better, but as being my fault. I had read every book on how that's not true. And for some reason, I thought, well, those books don't understand. All those books that say they don't understand what's going on. I have a complicated relationship here. He's under all this stress. He grew up in poverty, and he's making these huge changes to his socioeconomic status, and that's psychologically taxing. And I made every possible excuse, and he doesn't know what a happy family looks like, and so he would get really enraged. Um, when little things didn't bother me with the kids, that we would laugh, but something would break. And as long as everyone was okay, I would, sweep it up and go, oh, wow, that was an ugly vase anyway. Or, and he would get really enraged at those moments. Not that he cared about the stupid vase, or not that the mess affected him at all, but it seemed he would become enraged at the idea of not taking advantage of those moments to express anger. Like those were all chances to be a jerk, and he would get angry at someone not taking that opportunity. And I just kept thinking, it's the struggle. It's the struggle that's causing this. Once he has time away from his mother, you know, to heal, things will change. And he has a gruff exterior, but when I really need help with something, when the kids might really need something, he'll be there for us. So he graduated Yale and began working for Ron Paul. We moved to DC, and it was the first time I'd been away. You know what? I'm mixing up my own timeline. Ron Paul was between uh, college and Yale. That was the first time I've been away from school, from home. Then we moved to Connecticut to Yale. We moved so much. I'm sorry. Then we moved to Arizona, where he worked for the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court in Arizona, for Justice Ryan. But through all this, there was a weird through line of us leaving unexpectedly a lot, moving before we were supposed to move. He would set up internships. When he worked for Ron Paul, we left suddenly. I still don't know why. He was supposed to be there for a year. We left at 8 months with no notice. And I had a newborn baby. I could tell by his change of demeanor, he had already planned to move, looking back, before the baby was born. He was just waiting for the birth. As soon as I gave birth, you know, at home, basically unattended, in the bathroom floor of the townhouse we were renting, when we were working for Ron Paul, we were gone again, packed up, moved back to Las Vegas. After law school, he was clerking for the court in Arizona. Same thing. We were supposed to be there till September. June, we're packing up and moving cross country to Montana. I later did connect with his fellow clerk in the court, who said he was fired after a huge argument with the judge, or he believes he was fired. He doesn't know for sure, but there was a huge argument the day before that Stewart just left. It was over a case, which was strange. So there's this pattern of constantly moving, dropping everything, and he would always come up with some kind of reason why we moved. It sounded strange, but maybe reasonable if it had just been one time, but over and over and over again. Oh, we have to leave right now. We have to leave next week. And it's only been recently that because he's had so much publicity, things like talking with the other clerk of the court, and it's been easier for people to message me and say, "Oh, I knew you guys back then. I worked with him. This crazy thing happened," and that has been consistent. I'm still solving mysteries, really, for those, all of that. But the moving was constant. It seemed like he would get behind in work and not really do much of anything, and then we would move. And the other day I tried to, I've been working on my book. I have this timeline of all the places we lived, and it drives me crazy because I still screw it up. We moved at least every year, unless he was in school, but even though we were gone in the summers, and just constant, and it's cross country, and we'd move back to a place again and back and forth. It was just insane. And I tried to remember the different I tried to, in my brain, tried to remember all the different houses I've lived in, and sometimes I still wake up all these years later and don't know where I live. I can't, before I open my eyes, I can't picture what my own bedroom looks like sometimes. Um, so it was like that. And so after law school, um, and then after the Arizona clerkship, then we moved to Montana, where he took the bar, and he worked as a lawyer for a short time. Then we moved again, no notice. We just packed up and moved to Las Vegas. I still don't know why. He said it was because his mother had had cancer. She had had cancer for over a year before that. Um, it didn't seem to make any sense. So we moved back to Las Vegas. We started working as a construction default firm. And he got fired, and for not doing any work at all, basically. And that's when he started doing ghostwriting for legal briefs, which is, if you're an attorney, is literally the best gig there is. You just can't believe how incredible this is. They pay you like a lawyer. You work from home. You don't need to have the insurance. You don't need to pay for the insurance. You don't need to pay for a legal secretary. You don't need to pay for LexisNexis. They handle everything, and you work from your house. The only difference is you don't get your name on everything. And the work was unlimited. They were paying him $100 an hour. All he had to do was turn in the briefs. And he just wouldn't. He would take on all this work and then not do it. And he would stall, and he would call the courts and get extensions without telling the lawyer whose name was on. I mean, it was just, he was getting fired from doing legal brief work because he would just sit in front of his computer and, basically surf porn all day and not do the work. It was getting to the point where, I had done a lot of work for him in college. I had done some work for him in law school, but I was in over my head. At this point, I only had less than a semester of college really under my belt, and no way qualified for any of this. Um, just from, watching him study. And so even in law school, one of the things I would do is I would read books for him and then take notes and then hand them to him so he could pretend he had read the material to talk about in class. But now he's doing these legal briefs, and at one point he had a legal brief for this woman named Barbara Baker in Nevada, who clearly murdered her husband. He was running the appeal, and he had these books of court transcripts that all were marked, you cannot take this private, this can't leave the office, all over the house, and this thing is due. And I just knew he was going to try to make me write it. I could feel the vibe. So I started reading the case ahead of time in secret. I just started reading it until I had finally read it. And sure enough, several days before this thing is due, he gives me the same story he had given me, in college. Look, the rent's due. We're about to be evicted. All true. Um, and this appeal for this this woman serving life is due. So I wrote it. Yeah, that was denied. That one did not go through. But I mean, that's the kind of thing he would do, and I couldn't work outside the house because at that point it was really obvious I couldn't leave him with the kid. He couldn't be alone with the kids for 5 minutes, not without an older child, you know, even with the older kids present. Maybe I could leave the room to take a shower now that they were old enough to kind of, but even with that, I would have to set things up like, okay, and have to plan for half a day to try to take a shower. It's like, here's a movie and the kids will be downstairs and they'll be away from him. And just like trying to set up this whole situation so I can leave the room for 10 or 15 minutes. And it was kind of hellish. And all this time was this idea that once we reach the end of this struggle, the violence will stop, the controlling stuff. He understands that that's all wrong. He understands that it's not psychologically healthy, he would tell me, but it's really just that he's not on his path. He's not fulfilling his destiny. He doesn't know what it is yet. And then he said, well, I think I need to start a nonprofit. And I want something that's based on the idea of people who sworn an oath to the Constitution, and based in like military and police or whatever, people who swore that oath, basically creating a group where they would support each other and continuing to support and fulfill their oath to the Constitution, whatever that looked like. And originally it was a group called Oath Keepers for Ron Paul, and then it morphed into just Oath Keepers, and he basically the entire Ron Paul movement jumped on board in Nevada, which was huge. That was a huge group, and they didn't know what to do with themselves. They had been a lot of fun and energy, and it reminds me a little bit of when someone would try to quit smoking. Like the hardest part for them would always be the social structure, right? Because they have all these breaks and they have all this friend groups that are based on leaving work or school or walking outside or going to the smoking section and hanging out. The Ron Paul movement was lost. And they had all these social structures built on making these little viral videos and money bomb clips and hanging out and going to meetup.com and, oh, let's do this thing and let's hang signs. And now they're lost. Stuart was a huge participant in all those events, and now he's giving them something. Oh, let's switch it to Oath Keepers, and it'll be the same thing. And it kind of did. I mean, and it was so huge in Nevada in 2009 when he started it. It just went insane overnight, beyond anything I would have imagined. There were so many members, and so now we've had leaks and whatnot where they say how many members there were, but there were no member lists early on during those first days. And during those first days, there were so many members of Oath Keepers in Nevada. Stuart used to get pulled over, and the cop would just stop him and say, "Hey, I saw your car. I just wanted to shake your hand. Have a good day." Another time, there was a shooting in a bar between an attorney and an off-duty police officer. Nobody died. It was declared something similar to mutual combat. I think somebody got a fine or something. Both the cop and the attorney were members of Oath Keepers. I mean, it was just really kind of insane. Money started rolling in, and right away, he was weird with the money. We were living in this rental house in Las Vegas. Thankfully, it was almost this is talking about 2009, so it was almost foreclosed on. We were getting notices all the time from foreclosure places, and it was up for auction a couple times and then pulled back off by the owner or whatever. So lucky for us, that house was so deep into foreclosure that there was no sense in evicting us because they wouldn't be able to rent it out to anybody else. So us paying anything at all or owing money every month was enough to give us a place to live, because we would have been long evicted in any other circumstance. And remember, this is all happening when he was offered endless work. He could have worked 20 hours a day at $100 an hour. Honestly, he could have worked 5 hours a week and it would have paid every bill we had. We didn't spend much money. We didn't live on much, and we were getting sick all the time. And now looking back on it, I don't know why we never figured out a lot of the food storage we were eating was probably bad. And we were just living off like powdered cheese and all the Mormon cannery food storage from years prior. From honestly, it was probably from '99, and I mean there was zero food in the house. The bills were constantly getting shut off, and he had this bank account with $70,000 sitting in it. And for somebody who spent money on anything and everything, he seemed to have a hard time um, saying, "Well, I guess I should create a paycheck for myself, and then or if this is what he's going to do full time, probably needed some kind of structure. If he wasn't going to work in any other way, where at least the household bills were being paid." And at one point, he decided to sell. It was just bizarre decisions. Like he decided to sell T-shirts, and it's like, well, you could either spend the money on T-shirts or the power bill, and and our power bill got shut off. So I was just, and we had 5 kids at that point, and the whole thing was just so strange. And then later, I understood what he was doing is he was setting up a structure so that any pay or any money coming into Oath Keepers would never ever be considered pay or family money. It would be separate. And so that he would always have 100% access to all the money coming into Oath Keepers whenever he wanted. And it would just give him complete 100% financial control. And anytime I wanted to buy groceries or pay a power bill, he made me feel like I was stealing money. He would say, "Well, this is part of my paycheck, but this should probably go to." I mean, just 100% control, where my name was on nothing. And even the pay he was receiving, he would sort of pretend that that was like, "Well, we can't really afford to pay me, so we really shouldn't be having money into our personal account at all." So it just was a. I realized the strangeness of it was just a matter of him getting his ducks in a row for just 100% financial control over our entire family, and it worked. And it was in that he really found his niche in Oath Keepers. He grew up his mother was a minister um, for a long time, but when she wasn't a minister, she was a multi-level marketing salesperson, because it's the same skill set, right? This is the and the kind of minister she was like a new age type minister, and just always be selling. I mean, that's always, that was the thing. And public speaking was part of their lifestyle. And don't use notes. I mean, just everything about the way to sell and the way to get at people. And he would do self-defense classes that would make people cry because he knew all the tricks to get deep into their psyche. And the same thing with the constitutional classes. He would say little things to just get at people and just build them up in a way that made them feel special. He would talk about how much value they had as a person. You have value, you have worth. Pretend you're a child to defend. Would you want to? I mean, that's for like a self-defense class, but he would use the same technique for anything. Build them up to their just deepest vulnerabilities, which was a really a cue into how he did manipulate all the times. He was very intelligent, and he would focus in, you know, just really pinpoint any deep button you might have that could manipulate you and and make you feel like something was your fault, or he was very good at that. And he really you could just see how high he got from manipulating people, and for the attention and the crowds were getting bigger, and the crowds were getting bigger, and this Oath Keeper thing just started taking off. At one point, he gave a speech in I think it was Tennessee, and there were tens of thousands of people at this Tea Party event, all yelling "hoo-ah" with him. And when it started, it was so different from how it ended. A lot of people have been on the hook, for having their name on a list early on, and I don't know. I mean, there were people that legitimately thought they were joining the Promise Keepers when they joined Oath Keepers. And Stuart wouldn't tell them any different. The politicians would show up to the event to go, yeah, and then they think they were, and he would never tell them any different. He would just let them go on thinking that's what it was, just because he wanted to say they're a member, you know. And famous people joined. I wish I could think of his name. I think he's passed away now. The mail call guy joined. I can't think of his name, but he's a sort of a personality. You know what I mean? Aaron Lewis of Stained did multiple videos wearing his Oathkeeper hat, and they would hang out. And I mean, Stuart just basked in that and having a drink with Aaron Lewis, and just he was just high on the attention like nothing I'd ever seen before. And for a while, I thought maybe he was right. Like, oh, okay, he's not as violent, for a time, while he was distracted with this energy from this movement. He was not, of course, he wasn't home very much either, but he was not having these massive meltdowns. He wasn't, pointing his gun at a puppy or, I mean, just these horrible violent outbursts he would have. He was still the same. He was still very controlling, of course. He still controlled all the money, and in ways that I wasn't noticing until we went to separate, and I realized I couldn't even, hardly pay a utility or, without his permission because everything was in his name. So for a while, things were okay. And, um, he really tried to maintain this apolitical status. Oath Keepers was always going to be conservative leaning because of the military members. Um, and the culture, the overall culture of the group obviously is very conservative leaning. But he really did toe the line of this apolitical stuff for a while. And looking back, I realized it was because there were so many members of the old Ron Paul movement who were heavily involved in and on the board of directors, and a lot of them had been Democrats prior, and they were very serious about not becoming Republicans, about not um, turning it into that type of group. Now, Oath Keepers was never a 501c3, so it was never off the table to be political. It was a not for profit in Nevada only as a corporation, but it was never a full 501c3. They did file for that status for a separate group of some type after we separated. I found my lawyer found that, but I don't know anything about it. Um, so, but I think that he wanted to keep it as apolitical as possible because he wanted to maintain chameleon status for himself. Because in that way, um, the apolitical status of Oath Keepers could be his good cop, bad cop, depending on who he's talking to. Well, I can't get into that. I agree with you, whoever you are, whatever you say or whatever you believe in. I certainly agree with you, um, but I can't talk about that, because we try to stay apolitical, and then that would shift from group to group. And so then he wound up putting a lot of energy into preventing communication between different people within the organization, because you can't have group A talk to group C if they have completely different beliefs and supposedly you're on A and C's team. So he would do everything he could. He would spend hours upon hours with weird social manipulations on the telephone, um, talking to one group, trying to tell one group this other group doesn't like them, they're blocking them, they're mad at them over this thing, creating constant social, upheaval between different facets of Oath Keepers to prevent them from speaking to one another. But occasionally they would. And then he would have a whole group, like with Oregon, I think at one point with Idaho too, where the whole entire state would resign through their state leadership with a letter that would be like 7 pages long, and the last line would call him a narcissist. State, it would happen at least twice a year with a whole state. It was really the same pattern. And it wasn't until I think Bundy Ranch started a steamroll that he could not get himself out from under. I think, and this is a person with a very, very large ego, right? And actually zero empathy. Like, there were things that happened within our life. It was a time when I had a stillborn child and I had a miscarriage where I almost died. And he had zero. He did not care. He didn't get our, a child had died and, she's almost full term. And he was just irritated with me for, maybe being teary eyed 2 weeks later. I mean, it just, when are you going to pay attention to me again? It was all he cared about. He just had zero. When I was dying on the floor, he was telling me that, the carpet's going to stain if you don't, do something about that. I mean, he just didn't care. Until he thought that maybe dinner wouldn't be done, and then he suddenly cared a little bit. But I mean, this is just zero empathy, huge ego. And so with people with these huge egos, they tend to be very, very fearful, extremely fearful. I mean, you or I would not want to go to jail, and neither would anybody. But somebody with an ego like that, the fear level is just off the charts. Like, I might think, oh man, I did that thing, whatever, I have an unpaid ticket or whatever. Like, I better take care of that. I don't want to go to jail, right? But someone like him will turn it into, every waking, breathing moment of, oh my God, that horrible fear. And he was just so fearful. And yet will do things with, with no foresight to the future, because he's such so addicted to the now and the attention. And so after Bundy Ranch, he fell into this state. He fell into a state of, you just take every bad personality trait he had and just crank it to 11. Just crank it. He stopped showering. He quit cleaning out his empty eye socket. He didn't brush his teeth. He would sleep. He would sleep for like 15 hours and yell at people for waking him. When we moved out his stuff, we found pee bottles stashed in his stuff. I mean, it just, every single thing, he would go to the bathroom in his pants, and just things that, it's just a mentally ill person, just a completely mentally ill person. And then he would wake up and rage, just rage. He would point guns. He would scream until the windows rattled. And sometimes he would scream and scream and scream and fall asleep. And then 12 hours later, wake up, start screaming again, literally mid sentence where he fell asleep. It was crazy. And at this point, he had slowly moved us further and further out. And at this point, we're living maybe 20 miles to the highway. The closest cell service in the winter was at least, it was probably like 40 minutes to cell service. We had electric, like what you call like low electric. Like, we had electric, but not great electric. We had some electric, not like a full house of electric. You know what I mean? We had cords. And we had a 600 square foot cabin and some trailers. Like, my oldest kid lived in a trailer, and that's where we lived. And, we had one bathroom and the plumbing never worked, and nobody can make it out that far to fix it. And it's just really living rough. And he would leave and he would say, well, the car needs repair. So he'd drive the car, out to get repaired, and then just keep making up repairs that needed to be added to it, until at one point they had our car parked at this shop until they were frustrated with it. I mean, I think they had it for 6 months. And so he would leave and fly out and rent a car for himself and fly out, and then we would be in the woods, you know. literally in the woods, with, and with no contact, hardly, with the outside world for weeks at a time. And then he would fly in with his little rental car. And if we wanted to go to the store, if we needed anything besides food storage, it puts you in a weird psychological position where this person terrorizes you, but you look forward to them coming home so you can, buy some milk. And that's the kind of crazy we were living under toward the end after Bundy Ranch. And I believe that fear of arrest, once the arrests started happening after Bundy, and once when Malheur happened, he freaked out like you just could not believe. And I think it's because he knew maybe arrests weren't going to happen after Bundy Ranch as long as everything stayed smooth and nobody rocked the boat. And then Ammon Bundy rocked the boat with Malheur. And he just, and just the rage and the bizarre jealousy where he would just accuse me of cheating because I joked with the teenage kid at the deli counter about ringing the bell too loud, like to bring him to the counter. Like, I'm so sorry about that. And that's all it took for like this huge jealous rage, that I've been carrying on with this deli kid that lives, that works in a place that I couldn't possibly get to. I mean, just stuff like that. It just made no sense. Um, but I do believe that the fear, because he's such a fearful person, that just drove him to the brink and drove him to see no other out but to just take over the government in some way. I really believe in his mind. The ego gets so big, it starts shutting out, fear just sort of shuts out options, I think sometimes. When people live in that kind of fear, they might have all these other things, all these other routes in life to take to live happily, but they can't see any of it. They're blind just to that little narrow window. And he was so into this long psychotic episode that I think he just could see no other out to not getting arrested for Bundy except to either join the government in some way with Trump, or if not, to just overthrow it. I think that's where he got in the end. And it was for us personally, the violence ramped up so much that by 2016, I really thought up until then, I really actually believed that divorce was not possible. Like, not possible physically. He had told me over and over again if I ever tried, he would basically let me know that he would use his political connections, his legal connections, and I would be locked up in a mental institution. I would never see my children again. That I was mentally unstable, and he would, he would find a way to prove that. And that he knew everybody. And, in the end, I couldn't even get a restraining order. So there's probably not as much truth to what he said as he was implying, but as far as the judge not wanting to mess with him politically, that, there was probably a lot of truth to that. And the police department being on his side, probably a lot of truth to that, but I didn't know how much. And at the time, it's almost like a version of Stockholm syndrome. He seemed all powerful, and he was in a way, but not as much as I thought at the time, because I saw no other. He's the only person there is in my world at that point. He's the only transportation. He's the only the only access to feed the kids, or and you just become so controlled that you forget that there's life outside of it. But I do believe it drove him absolutely insane. He drove himself insane with his own behavior and his own, and just even going back a little bit, like, he always had these tendencies in his personality. Like, I can remember when we were kids, I'm like 19, he's like 26 or something. Him, it seemed like an important moment. And so I always held on to it. We were in a parking lot and he went to check the oil, and he got back in the car and he was just so furious with me. And I had no idea why he was furious. And it was because I didn't get out of the car and stand behind him and guard him while he was checking the oil. because anybody could have come up behind him and slammed the hood on his head, you know. And I had grown up with a lot of siblings, and I've seen my dad and brothers check oil in parking lots a million times. I never once saw anyone request a guard behind them, and he acted like it was I was absolutely insane for not understanding that something could have happened to him, and you know, somebody could have. Yes, someone could have. And someone could probably run you over at any point. But we do live in a society where we trust each other a little bit not to do that for the most part, right? Um, but yeah, that's the shortest version of that life. And then 2 years of planning to get out. Honestly, 6 months to find a lawyer. 6 months to find a lawyer who would take this crap on because nobody needed this in their life, you know. Um, yeah. So that's a very short version.
So in the end, what happened? We hear the news, we read the news stories about him getting convicted for, I believe it was conspiracy to commit sedition against the U.S. government. What happened?
Well, so I separated from him. The last time I saw him outside of a courtroom, I believe, was February 2018, outside of exchanging kids for short visits and supervised visits. Yeah, so I believe things went much crazier as soon as we separated. He lived in Montana for a short time, but like I knew he would, he immediately went to Texas um, after that. He used to spend a lot of time in Texas. At that point, he was very close with Alex Jones. I could tell every time Alex Jones coached him on the divorce process by the by the language he would use when he would write me an email like, "Oh, this is Alex Jones talking." I think he wound up on Alex Jones's couch for a while, and so that was his crowd, right? He was that's the crowd he's hanging with. Somewhere in there, he started supporting Trump openly, which was not the case when we were still together. He always said all these people want him to be one of Trump's brown shirts. It'll never happen. Trump's a fascist. You know, these are the things he said. You know, back when. Within weeks of our separation, he's front row, or months. He's front row at some Trump event um, that he never, you know, never mentioned supporting Trump in any way. So he fell into that crowd for sure. But again, it seems his goal has shifted. Before Bundy Ranch's goal was as much attention as possible, chameleon as much as possible to as many people as possible. And then it seemed his goal after Bundy Ranch was entirely fear based and entirely based in I do not want to be arrested. I need to control the government to not be arrested. So, which I don't know why he thought that would work out, but he did sometimes see himself almost as like a religious figure. Like sometimes he believed himself to be sort of magical. Sometimes he had this kind of odd thinking where he saw himself as this sort of born leader. He had these kind of strange beliefs in that way. Maybe it's from growing up with the sort of new age belief system or something. I don't know what to blame it on. It's just him. So somewhere in there, he started getting more and more militant, and I was just happy he was in Texas, so my kids aren't such at risk. And as J6 started approaching, I started getting calls from media saying, "What do you think? What do you think?" And you know, at this point, he still has wielded a lot of legal power. I was under a full gag order. I was told if I spoke to someone who spoke to someone who spoke to someone who talked to social media, you know, I would be on the hook and could lose custody of my kids. And this is the kind of gag order I was under during this time. So I did actually speak to somebody at the Atlantic who was writing for the Atlantic, Mike Giglio. Spoke to him off the record, and I was so scared he was going to just um, tell everybody who I was, but he didn't. He just said a source close, and I think he even said he to make it to disguise me further. It was, but they seemed interested and afraid of what might happen on J6, and I really, I was surprised on which side Stewart came down during the pandemic. And initially, he came down on the side of full control. And then he found out that wasn't popular and he switched. He lost members. His Reverend Chuck Baldwin resigned because of the letter he sent out to governors saying that they should use they should look into using the National Guard for checkpoints to check temperatures for
Wait,
people.
so
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Stewart Rhodes was all in on lockdown.
Oh yeah, yep.
So what
2
happened?
weeks.
What changed?
It was unpopular, and then 2 weeks later, he was at a tattoo shop in New York at an unmasked event. I think with I wish I could think of his name. Starts with the last name with an M. Last name starts with an M. Um, anyway, he was somebody who was convicted also or pled out. J6, but yeah. So that's the kind of chameleon. Like that's the kind of person. Like somebody who could. We're gonna check temperatures. We're gonna have checkpoints between Idaho and like he was actually, I believe, possibly even behind some of these checkpoints that kind of were set up here and there with Idaho and in Montana of, you know, what's your COVID status? Because he was always been in the business of exploiting fear and an emergency for his gain. And so he acted too soon, which he had had a habit of doing in the past, um, jumping too soon and calling for, oh, end of the world. Looks like I got to be in charge. Sorry, guys. I don't want to be in charge, but I have to be. You know, I'm so sorry. It's a revolution, and here I am. And so he was always super eager for that. And I think he just jumped too soon and it wasn't popular. And Chuck Baldwin, which leader of Liberty Fellowship, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but he left Florida. He was a following in Florida and he came to Montana and he's hooked up with Ryan Zinke and Paul Valet and all those people. And um, yeah, and he immediately resigned. I don't know what got into Stewart. I don't know if he's an informant. Maybe he's always been an informant. I don't know. This is crazy. So immediately Stewart acted like none of that ever happened. He was doing mass protests and all over the place. I believe the last time my kids ever had to see him, he flew from Texas to Montana, did a 1-day visit with them in December 2020, and then they never saw him again. Then then I didn't know if he was really. I had a feeling he would participate in January 6th, and I wasn't sure how, because he did sometimes freak out and say, no, don't go to this thing. Like he did, Charlottesville, when he found out racists were going to be there, it's just like, no, don't go, don't go, don't go. But people still went. And because he knew that would threaten his PayPal. I mean, anything that would threaten his PayPal was off limits, right? And
So, I'm glad you brought that up because I just recently interviewed someone who was at Charlottesville, and we're seeing this embrace of these alt-right, radical right. Some people call them Nazis, whatever,
Mhm.
white supremacist groups infiltrating Republican groups,
Mhm.
the far right. So it sounds like I'm hearing your story, and it's you keep talking about him as a chameleon, which
Mhm.
to me says, well, a chameleon's never not a true believer.
No, he doesn't believe in anything. He
And
really doesn't.
yeah, and so it's like whatever they thought would be what gets them their end result, which is money, power, influence. And so this idea that he would 1 minute he's for COVID lockdowns, the next he's anti-mask. 1 minute he is backing Bundy and everything, and the next he's maybe not. And then you see him, and I think in the book you mentioned, at one point he was for Black Lives Matter, and then he was
Yes.
turned on them, just like Ammon
Yes.
Bundy. He supported Black Lives Matter at one
They were
point.
going to do a joint march.
Yeah. And they're like, "Hey, we should go defend these protests in solidarity." Okay,
Yeah.
but then you see, and it's really interesting to hear you say he was telling people not to go to Charlottesville, and good for him for
Yeah.
saying that. But and then we're seeing the same thing now that I see another militia group leader in Idaho saying the same thing, like, "Hey, we need to separate ourselves from these fascists that are infiltrating these groups because that doesn't help our cause.
Yeah.
So it's a spectrum of, yes, they're militant, they're far right, they're extremist, but there's some lines they won't go to. And it's interesting that he said that, I don't want to be a brown shirt for Trump. And then of course he ended up being
Mhm.
the guy January 6th.
Yeah, I mean, for Stewart, he still wanted to try to maintain that. Well, one, he did grow up. He's only a quarter Mexican, but he did grow up culturally. Like they spoke Spanish in the house he grew up in, and his mother grew up Mexican. They were farm workers. The only grandfather he ever knew was Filipino. So, and all his friends during school were usually, I think his best friend his whole life was a black man, and so he grew up that way. He did not grow up in, like white culture, but he did grow up being taught to assimilate as much as possible
Right.
for the
So he
sake of fitting in.
diversity.
And he would really did take personal offense at any hint of racism. He would, I mean, just really, really angry. And so when the Charlottesville thing came up, he agreed to go, and then he found out, I can't even remember who was like Brittany Pettibone. When he first heard about her being, I think she was going to be there, and it turned out even worse. Like, right, that was just the beginning. When he found out she was going to be there, he canceled, and then he told everyone, like, if you're going to go, you better not be wearing Oathkeeper gear because we're not going, and we're not going to be seen there. And he got a lot of backlash. Like he had already bought plane tickets
Wow.
for everybody that was going, and he lost all that money, and he still do not go, don't wear shirts. And then some guys wore shirts, but his greatest fear was, I mean, at that point, it's not, yeah, I know he took personal offense at racism, but really I do believe it was more about, how much longer can we take Stripe or PayPal, and he did lose PayPal after that event.
Oh, because yeah. So it's
Yeah.
you bring up a name, Brittany Pettibone,
Mhm.
who is known here in Idaho. So Pettibone, married Martin Snellner in a ceremony in Austria. And at that wedding, there's a photo with a guy named Dave Riley and his wife. They're dressed up in like this red sash right there in Austria. Pettibone had actually gone to a North Idaho, Kootenai County Republican Central Committee meeting requesting help um, from the committee that they would appeal to the congressman and the congressional delegation that her husband was being denied a visa because he was from Austria. Martin Snellner, who, by the way, had financial ties to the Christchurch shooter. He was a big part of this white supremacy movement in Europe, from
Oh,
Austria. Okay. So Brittany Pettibone is well known. Her
wow.
father, I believe, was a committee member of the Kootenai County Central Committee. So interesting that she was the trigger there for him,
Yeah.
was following her because
Yeah.
now we know Dave Riley there's been multiple news reports showing that he was hired by the Idaho Freedom Foundation. And
Oh.
not only was he at Charlottesville, there's some reports to say that, remember the tiki torch thing? That may have been his idea. Um, and so here he is in Idaho pulling shenanigans, working directly with Republican central committees in Idaho, working behind the scenes and getting paid by the largest, one of the most powerful far right lobbying groups whose own members that they helped get elected were known oath keepers. Like one guy, this
Mhm.
legislator by the name of Chad Christensen, bragged about being a member of the Oath Keepers on his profile, and also would brag about how he's an alpha male. Uh, so it all kind of
That always makes me it's just so ridiculous. The alpha male thing is so ridiculous. It always makes me just crack up.
right, because they would see Oath Keepers as this, like, path for, like, I'm a tough guy. I'm an alpha male if you're a member of the Oath Keepers, then it would show that you're part of that club. Um,
Yeah.
so really interesting that was the trigger for him, was petting them.
Yeah. It really yeah, I remember him. He was familiar with her. Okay. He was familiar, but not he knew her name, and he said, I think she's some kind of racist. And he wound up um, going over her um, videos and such for just forever, just poring over them. And character there. Just poring over her videos and they were bad. It was bad. I mean, there was no wiggle room in there, whether she's racist or not, you know. And then I was told, I really, whenever possible, wasn't paying much attention to what Stuart was doing after we separated. But I was told, I think, this is some journalist told me, no, he actually shared a stage with her afterwards. He was just hanging out with all those people, from like 2020 on. He just gave up on all of that, and he didn't even care. He just appeared anywhere.
So, so he didn't care, knowing that they were white supremacists or in
Yeah,
movement.
yeah,
That did,
yep,
I mean, even though he may not have personally agreed with them, or at least at one point he was saying that,
yeah.
he just,
So he got desperate enough, you know,
hmm.
that I mean, I guess you can justify anything like, oh, we're in a fight for our lives, so you know,
It sounds like he saw the writing on the wall, which was this
hmm
trend of, you have the Griper movement, you've got Nick Fuentes, you've got these loud white supremacist anti-Semitic groups, individuals, the America First movement. They have a large following, and that following,
hmm
their ideas aligned with the methods, the tactics, the ideology that was shared by the Oath Keepers. And so to get
yeah,
the audience and the support, and like you said, the money's still rolling, you need them.
yeah.
And
You need it, yeah. And he had always disliked Proud Boys in particular. Like that was a huge rivalry. Did not get along with Proud. They almost never. Only maybe in Berkeley when it was just a free for all, which the board of Oath Keepers just was furious with him for attending the Berkeley events because they're obviously political, and they were very much against political actions and supporting a political candidate. Yeah, those Berkeley was pretty much the first time I think he had ever appeared anywhere alongside the Proud Boys. And I think most of it started because he was really jealous of Gavin McInnes.
mm, okay, that makes some sense.
He didn't like because Gavin would always get top billing if they appeared like to give speeches, not like the whole contingency or whatever. But whenever there was a time when they were both giving speeches, Gavin McInnes would come first, and then Stuart would make up like act like his plane was late. He had to get there late. So he'd go on after.
You've talked about your experience with Stewart, what happened, and I'm happy for you that you're able to get out of this toxic relationship. But one thing that comes up is, someone like this doesn't move forward without a following. And
Yeah.
there seems to be this predatory trend towards finding and recruiting aimless souls and channeling their
Mhm.
angst to serve extremist leaders for their own narcissistic purposes. So, in your experience, what kind of people did you see Stewart seek out, and how did he recruit them?
Almost immediately, I mean, obviously, Oath Keepers is focused on veterans, but he really hyper focused. It was like striking gold for him to get a hold of someone with pretty severe PTSD, and so that was a big deal. I mean, it seemed like, well, on one side there were a lot of people who were recovering drug addicts, for one, or people that he definitely recruited. Um, and return veterans, but he really liked to manipulate. In particular, he looked for people who were looking to recreate that feeling. And I think what was really particular for him with returning veterans, you know, there's that feeling of being a part of a brotherhood, right? But on top of that, I think a lot of returning veterans also, one, they lose status, right? As soon as they come home, if they're not active duty anymore, they've lost that status, of where they were because their skills don't apply so well, in civilian life. But there's also, I see in a lot of these guys, you just feel that they miss the sense of a mission of doing something important that was, high risk, um, but they could just let go of every other thought in their head and just focus on an important task and do something greater than themselves. And that's, you could just see the longing to be a part of that again. And a lot of these guys were disabled, so couldn't go back in, didn't have the option of re-upping. So Stewart really manipulated both the trauma that they were dealing with. He manipulated their need to, their difficulty in readjusting to civilian life. But he would really hit and twist that desire for a mission and a brother. He was very see how excited he would just get the way he would manipulate people during classes or speeches, where he would just look for what they were longing for and then offer it to them. You know, you're important. You were put here for a reason. You have skills, you have dedication, you have loyalty. And now I have something for you to do, and something that you were put on this earth to do, you know?
So it sounds like he would focus on building this community because community was important because one, it brought in the money
Mm-hmm.
for him. It gave him the attention he sought, amplified his need for all of this and helped him fulfill that. But also what's interesting is he would do this while sacrificing, based on what I heard from you, attention to his own family. So these
Oh,
conservative groups, right? You look at this
yeah.
all the time. These conservative groups, they call themselves conservative groups, are all about family values, and they're out there just using their communities and their groups to say, "Oh, we're fighting for families. We're fighting to stop porn in libraries. We're doing this. We're creating these fear-based tactics and narratives to say that we are defending families. Yet, then when you look deep down at some of these individuals, let's look at how they treat their own families. Look at how he treats
Yeah.
you, and it just, once again, it goes back to they're chameleons, they're grifters.
Yeah.
Uh, it's scary. And so when people follow these individuals, when they join these social networks, these communities, engage in extremist, they need to think twice about that, right? Like,
Yeah.
what are you doing? Why are you joining this? Do you not understand what you're a part of? And I look back at your experience and I realize that you've been through a lot. Leaving an abusive relationship can be difficult. And now looking back on it now from your current perspective, which is different from the perspective of when you were there living it,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
what do you see different now that you're living um, outside that world from versus when you were living in it?
Wow, that's hard to say. My world is bigger. My world is bigger. That's the number one thing that I would say is, because when you live in constant fear, your world is so small. And earlier I was talking about Stuart being fearful and it cutting off what he could see as options. A million options are there, he doesn't see them. Well, I was really also talking about myself, because that's what fear does. Were there times I could have left? I've certainly heard plenty of journalists say that. Why didn't you leave him there? Look at this timeline. There was a window here where you could have been safe. Well, in retrospect, yeah. Okay, yeah, there was a 6-month window I probably could have left safely, but that's awful hard to see from inside. All you see in that mode is, how do I get, oh, it's 1:45 p.m. now. How do I get to 2:45 p.m. alive? With the kids alive. How do I get from here to there safely? How do I get them psychologically safely, from the dining room to the kitchen in the next 30 minutes, from here to there in this space, from here to there in this timeline, without psychological damage, without guns being pointed, without screaming his head off, without, trying to shoot the dogs, or, just how do I get from this tiny little moment in time and space to that tiny little moment in time and space? And now, you know, now the day is a full day, and it's a full year to plan and years to plan ahead. And it's my tiny little spot, in Montana, but it's also in this country, in this world. And everything is so much bigger in it. You know, the idea that things that were going on with Stewart could affect the entire country never ever occurred to me, and people ask if I encouraged him to be at Bundy Ranch or whatever. Well, yeah, I didn't want him to come home. I wasn't thinking about the impact of Bundy Ranch. I just didn't want him in the house. I wasn't thinking of there's no bigger picture. It's just how do I get from here to tomorrow? And so that's one of the biggest things in perspective for me is just the lack of fear, which feels odd in some ways. And the second he was sentenced and I knew he wasn't going to walk away, it's like being set back. It's not like a positive because it's a lack of it's a lack of fear. So it's a positive in that it's a removing of a negative. So it's like it was like being in a room full of horrible, awful, nonstop noise for years that suddenly went silent. It's not like you're it's like you're just now you just are. You're not living with this horrible thing over you. You're just living. And it was like a sudden expanse of existence of like, oh, okay, I can breathe. I can see beyond this. I can think about tomorrow. I can think about next year. My kids. I can think about what my kids are doing. I never once thought about next year, or what my kids are going to be doing, when they grow up. And now these things are happening. People are growing up and moving on, and I got to go back to college a little bit, working on that, working on my book, and just like the world is bigger, and it's bigger than politics, even, and I've changed political parties, but I don't feel like I fit in any party. If that makes sense, like
Yes.
you know, I don't. I see both sides and I see the little things that don't make sense. Just because the environment switches doesn't mean you're supposed to suddenly switch all your beliefs. So I see failings in the Democratic side, I see failings in the Republican side. I jokingly say, well, I guess I just hate everybody. Oh, it's not true, but I just feel like I don't feel like my perspective yet is quite nestled into place. It's almost like it's almost expanded so much that I'm just sort of looking at things from the outside still. you know?
Right, and you experience some critical points in U.S. history, right? These moments, especially here in the Western states, these inflection points where um, so much happened and rallied around, like you said, the Bundy standoff, Mall, your January 6th, all these things that you had a front row seat to some of the uh,
Yeah,
and I look back and I listen to your story and I just, it feels like there's just so much trauma there. You've experienced so much. I guess my question
yeah.
for you is, how are you processing that? Like, what are you doing for you?
I for the first time ever last fall, I started in therapy, which was wild because it's very strange. Like I keep wanting to go, but how are you doing today? It's really weird to have someone, how are you doing? Why does anyone care how I'm doing? It's really strange. But it made me realize, yeah, you have to do those things, and um, that and learning that it's okay to just go forward at a really steady pace. Everything doesn't have to be right now. Everything doesn't have to be, um, you know, it. I lived under straight adrenaline until he was sentenced and until my divorce was final. Just absolutely, those things happened within 2 days of each other. My divorce, and then 2 days later was his sentencing, and the kids were given freedom from him. All his parental legal rights were completely severed, um, and then he was sentenced, hopefully not to be pardoned later, but um, just I lived under full adrenaline. Like I am somebody who in personality might sometimes feel nervous walking through a store because I feel like people are looking at me. And then all of a sudden I was going on, you know, MSNBC live on a morning show, probably went on live news shows about 10 times. And I mean, I didn't even think about it. I just, oh, I got to do this. I got to do that. I got to do this and I got to do that and I got to do this and I got to make sure. And I, you know, never being a forward person, out of nowhere when he was arrested, just called the judge and said, I got to talk to you. There's stuff, you're going to let him go home on bail. And there's stuff you don't know. And they reconvened for me, and I am the least assertive person I have ever met, but I was living under such adrenaline for that time. And really, that was last May. So it's really been, you know, less than a year that I've been, okay, let's work on healing some of this because there is so much trauma that and some of that has been literally just trying to find my, someplace politically, trying to I've been offline. I think I've been offline for months. Yesterday I got to get back into current events, and I start looking at current events, and then 45 minutes later I still didn't know anything about current events, but I want to know where Kate Middleton is. And so that's as far as I got with that, and that was a fail. But just trying to just sort of resonate with some of the trauma and trying to understand. Writing my book has been working on it and just been really focusing on it, and that has been hugely healing because I can write something or I can read something I wrote 3 years ago and realize because that perspective blamed me. 3 years ago I was still blaming me for all of this, and I guess that's okay with a memoir, right? Because it is from the perspective of the person, but it's interesting to see, well, that's not correct. This wasn't on me. This, so it's just been really interesting, and it's been a little confusing and bewildering, and understanding that sometimes there's just setbacks. There's just some days where I just, you know, um, sometimes I go to town and still see, cars. Not everybody has pulled off their Oath Keeper bumper stickers yet, and uh, sometimes I just have to sit in my car and cry a little bit, and that's just how it is, And but it's been a process for sure that is ongoing and probably will be years going forward. Honestly,
Absolutely. I mean, it's a lot.
yeah,
Last question, I guess, looking back, I mean, you endured this relationship, you endured all this trauma and abuse from someone I think we could safely say is authoritarian, engaged in extremist tactics.
yes.
What what would you say were some of the red flags authoritarians display that might signal that person might be abusive? So, advice for people in the future, right?
Okay,
They're talking to people, they're dating someone, and they see these, they see something. What are these red flags to look for to say,
I can.
maybe
Yeah,
maybe this is not a good idea?
I thought about this a lot because they hide very, very well. But one thing I think is a really good indicator is the need to blame immediately on anything happening. A drink spills. They either immediately will tell you it's your fault, somebody else's fault, the waiter's fault, um, or they blame themselves and it's this horrible thing, right? Oh, I'm so stupid. I spilled that cup. I would say a green flag would be the cup spills and it spills because sometimes there's spills. And it's not your fault, it's not the waiter's fault. Maybe somebody knocked it and it doesn't matter. But I do notice that there is a tendency, this panic to assign blame for even things that are blameless or don't matter in the least. It doesn't matter if you dropped something, it doesn't matter if you forgot, the combination to a lock, or these things are inconveniences, but that is a common thing in these types is that panic to blame, whether it's accepting blame and making a big deal out of it and saying horrible things to themselves, wherein you have to jump in. Oh, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. It's okay. No, it creates the whole drama over tiny, tiny little things. That's one. Um, Constantly shifting reasons, always having a reason for odd behaviors, for the abusive people that are more intelligent, the sneakier ones that are better able to, and sometimes even have a running narrative as to why they sometimes act this way. Another red flag, I would say, maybe not so much for abusive people, but more for, like you said, like the authoritarian, the type of people who are going to take it to the next level, is it's just sort of vague to put your finger on, but it's an inability to join with other people in a social way, um, without finding a way to be outside of it, leading it. Because let's say you're all getting together to go shooting, right? Just going to do some casual shooting. There's knocks to the ego that are going to happen, right? There's always someone who doesn't shoot that well. If somebody's gun is a piece of crap, right? Someone's got a jam, they don't know how to clear it, or there's happy animal. There's always going to be little things, right? Those things are so uncomfortable to an authoritarian person, that they have a tendency to pull themselves out of it, stand to the side, and start leading. And then when it's all over, you realize you never saw them shoot. Or this could be at any, it doesn't, I mean, shooting is just one example. Obviously, that's from my memory, but but this could happen with a volleyball game. This could happen with anything, right? Where they will slowly withdraw themselves and find a way to either lead, or if they can't lead, they'll find an excuse for why they have to take a phone call. They have to be out of it because they cannot interact in the back and forth banter of being pals with people, working together, of the razzing that might go on, the support that might go, the back and forth. They can't do it. They can't do it. And I think looking back, I've thought of a million examples of times where Stuart or other people, because I've certainly seen plenty of other like him that came and went, started their own groups or whatever, the same behavior over and over again, an inability to just be pals and to work together now and then, even, cooking together, or just anything. They have to step back and run the thing, or take a side role and run some other, but there's some reason why they can't work together. And that is just every time. Really every time. An inability to take blame, and oh, sorry about that, without sarcasm, without, oh, I'm so sorry you did this all wrong, but an actual, oh, yeah, I overslept. I can't believe I did that. Sorry about that. That's, not, oh, I'm sorry you didn't, wake me up in time, or I'm sorry your schedule's so screwy it's at the wrong time, or so that would be my advice. Those are things I've thought about a lot in the last few years. Yeah.
Well, Tasha, I really appreciate your time and your insight and your experience and sharing that with everyone. I guess last question, if you have any other parting wisdom or thoughts you'd like to share.
um, Holy cow, that's a big question. I just think, I just desperately want to go back to a time where, without all these algorithms pushing us all into little pinpoints of viewpoints, and only showing us things that we agree with, that, people can sit around the Thanksgiving table and have completely different political opinions on everything, and go, all right, let's eat, pass potatoes. you know and that's, I have a real big problem with algorithms, I think, that are pushing us all toward hating each other, and we're kind of letting it happen. And people should be able to get along and talk and discuss things. Right now my son's running for office as a Democrat against a Republican, and they really like each other. Dakota says, I hate running against this guy. I really like him. I don't. It makes me uncomfortable. He's a really nice guy. I kind of hope I don't win. I would vote for him if I wasn't running. I wish more people saw the world that way. So.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. Thanks for everything.
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on. And good luck to everything, to the journey you guys are on as your family, and love to your family for sure.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.
Disclaimer. The following is intended to convey an opinion on newsworthy events of public concern regarding public figures and or public officials in the exercise of their official duties. No implications or inferences beyond those explicitly stated in the proceeding are intended to be conveyed or endorsed by the author. Wherever available, links have been provided to allow the listeners or readers to directly access any underlying assertions of fact upon which this opinion is based.